Welcome back. Now, before jumping right into SASS code, let's first take a look at what SASS actually is. So this lecture is designed to give you a very quick overview of what SASS is, how it works, and what features it includes. So, putting it in very simple terms, SASS is a CSS preprocessor, an extension of CSS that adds a lot of power and elegance to the basic language. So basically, we use SASS to fix the problems that we have with CSS. CSS gets very messy very quickly, and for huge projects, having a single CSS file with thousands of lines of code, without any reusable pieces, without any logic, gets completely unmanageable after some time. And that's why we use SASS, which provides us with a couple of handy features and tools that CSS simply doesn't have, while at the same time not changing the fundamental way that CSS works. This, in particular, makes SASS very easy to learn, and so I'm sure that you'll be up to speed with SASS in no time. And the way SASS works is like this. Instead of writing a CSS file with regular CSS code, we write SASS code in SASS files. Then we run a compiler, and that compiler converts the SASS code we wrote into regular CSS code, as if all we ever did was writing regular CSS in the first place. So we need to process our SASS code first, and that's why it's called a CSS preprocessor. So our website has no idea that the code we wrote in the beginning was in SASS, because it only ever sees the final output of the compiler, in the form of CSS, of course. Okay? Does it make sense? Now there are actually other CSS preprocessors like less or stylus, but SASS is the most popular one, which is why I chose it for this course. So, what are these features that SASS actually gives us? Let's get a quick overview before we actually start writing SASS, so that we know what we're looking at here. First, SASS gives us variables, which, just like in normal programming languages, allow us to have reusable values such as colors, font sizes, spacing, etc. Next, we have nesting, in order to nest selectors inside of one another, allowing us to write less code. Next up, there are operators for mathematical operations right inside of CSS. Then, partials and imports, which are one of the most important and most useful features of SASS, allowing us to write CSS in different files and then importing them all into one single file. Next, there are Mixins, to write reusable pieces of CSS code, and also functions, which are quite similar to Mixins, with the difference that they produce a value that can be used later. Next up, we have extends, which can be used to make different selectors inherit declarations that are common to all of them. And finally, control directives allow developers to write complex code using conditionals and loops like in a real programming language. However, we do not cover this topic in this course because it's usually not needed in a real-world project. It's more for writing CSS frameworks or something. So, this was just a very high-level overview of SASS, and in the next two lectures, we're actually going to start using this, and everything will make a ton of sense to you. And now, one other thing before we start writing SASS, maybe you have been Googling SASS before and looked at some SASS code and seen different ways that the code looks. And that's right, there are actually two SASS syntaxes, which can be quite confusing, so let's clear that up. So one syntax, which is actually the original one, is just called SASS, like the language, and the other one is called SCSS, which stands for Sassy CSS. The SASS syntax is indentation sensitive and doesn't use any curly braces and semicolons, as you see here on the left side. However, I find this syntax a bit confusing, and I find it also more difficult to learn, and also more difficult to convert original CSS projects to SASS with the syntax. And that's why I prefer the SCSS syntax, which preserves the way that original CSS looks like. And that's why SCSS is what we're going to use in the rest of this course. Now, if for some reason you prefer the SASS syntax, please feel absolutely free to use that one, because everything should still work the exact same way, it will just look different. Alright, and that's it for the basic SASS intro. In the next lecture, we're finally going to dive right into it. So don't wait and hit play on that next video. So, are you excited to learn something new right now? Then you're in the right place. because we're going to start using SASS variables and nesting right now. And once more, we're going to use CodePen here, instead of starting to write SASS right in our code editor. And that's because if we wanted to use SASS on our local computer right now, then we would first have to install and configure it, and then compile the SASS code to CSS. But right now, all we really want to do is to just learn SASS and start using it, and not having to worry about all the configuration stuff. And CodePen allows us to do exactly that. So in order to follow along with this lecture in the next one, just come here to codepen.io and then just create a new pen. So just like this. And then in here we can write our HTML or CSS and JavaScript, and it will render the results down here. We can also configure a bunch of stuff. We're not going to write any JavaScript code, so let's just close this one. And then we can set some settings here. For example, for the CSS or CSS preprocessor will be SASS. And remember, we have SASS and SCSS, which actually stand both for SASS, but with a different syntaxes. And so remember, we are going to use SCSS, which stands for SASSy CSS in this course. So this is going to be our preprocessor, and then CodePen will automatically compile our code that we write here to CSS. So it says here already SCSS now, right? So we're just going to build a very small example here in these two lectures, just to get you familiar with stuff. So we're going to write a small navigation. And so let's start by very quickly marking that up in the HTML here. So nav, then in there we have an unordered list with a class of navigation. And in there we have a bunch of links. And I'm sure you have done something like this before. And just an empty link here, okay? So something like this, about us. Okay, let's copy this one. And then close it. So we want something different here. Let's say pricing. And contact. So just follow along with me here. Just copy this code, this HTML code, so that we can then start writing the SASS, which is what we really want. Okay, so we have this navigation here on this side, and then we just want two buttons sitting on the other side of the navigation bar. Okay, so you'll see later what I'm trying to do here. So this is just a div that will hold these two buttons. The button main, pointing to nowhere once again, and then another one. Unfortunately, this CodePen doesn't really have an autocomplete function, so we have to really type out the entire code, which is a bit boring, but that's what we have to do. And then just close the div and close the nav element. And that's it. So that's our simple markup. Now before we do anything else, let's do a normal reset like we did on our other project as well. So let's just say margin 0 and padding 0. Okay? And now let's start styling the nav element. So let's say we want a margin of 30 pixels and some background color. Now colors are a typical use case for SASS variables. So let me show you how SASS variables actually work. Now first of all, what is a variable? So a variable is just like a container where we can store some data. For example, like the name of a color. And then we can reuse it all over our code. So we just have to define it once and then can use it everywhere. And if, for example, we then wanted to change that color, we only would have to change it in the variable definition, and it would automatically change all over the code. So let's define a variable, and this is how it works. So let's call this one color primary. Now color I'm giving it is this one. So F9ED69. So this is just a yellow color that I have selected before for this project. Okay, so let me just comment this here. And actually what you can do in SASS is to write comments like this. So instead of having to write like we do in normal CSS, so just like this, then here a comment, then like this. In SASS, it's actually easier. We can just do this double slashes. So just this, and then we can say, this is a yellow color. Okay? And so all we have to do now here is to write color primary. So let's see what happens. Here we go. So here is our yellow background color. So again, this is what happened. We stored this piece of data here, this piece of text in this case, in the color primary variable. And we then used that color variable down here, and it read the data from our variable definition, which is up here, right? And we could now go ahead and use this variable wherever we wanted. Now imagine that we wanted to change it. So let's cut it here and just write red, for example, and then it would change to red, right? That's not what we want, of course. So let's put our yellow color back here. Okay, and that are variables. So note that you always have to define a variable name starting with this $sign here, okay? So that is how SASS identifies variables, always starting with this $sign. And since we're here defining variables, let's actually add 2 more colors here already. So color secondary, which is kind of an orange. So F08A5D, orange, and then another color, tertiary. So the third color, and this is a pink, B83B5E. Okay, so let's now actually style the navigation itself. But before we do that, we can also save or pan here. So just hit save. Then it will ask you to create a new account here, but that's not really necessary because all that matters is that it changed this link here. And so now if you want to share this with someone, you just have to copy this link and paste it. And so for example, if you have a question with some problem with your code, and if you want to share it to get some help, then you can simply go ahead and copy and paste this URL here. Okay? Now something else we can do here is to click here and then see our compiled CSS. So this is the SASS code which is compiled to this CSS code. And it's very simply this code. So the variables, they of course don't produce any CSS code. They are just there to store some data for us. And then here the variable that we had here for the background color was simply replaced with the variable that we defined. So exactly as I showed you. So you see here, color primary is F9ED69. And now when we see the compiled CSS, that's exactly what you have here. So that is what the compiler does behind the scenes. Okay? Now, about the navigation, let's first select it. And the first thing we can say is that we want no list style. List style none. And so these small bullets will disappear. Okay. Now we want to select these LI items here, right? So these ones. And so this is an excellent time to talk about nesting. So how would you usually do it without SASS if you wanted to select this LI item? Probably you would just write something like this. So navigation, and then LI, and then just select it like this, right? But with SASS and with nesting, we can actually do better than that. All we have to do in order to replace this is to write LI right in here. And that's it. So these are nested selectors. So we first select the navigation, and then inside the navigation, we select the LI elements. So it's exactly what we have in here. But SASS allows us to write this in this easier way, so we have to type less code, and it's also better organized, I think. So again, this selector here basically means that we want to select the LI, which is inside of the navigation, right? And so this is exactly what we have here. We select the navigation, and then the LI is inside the navigation. And so we can write the selector inside of the navigation selector. Does it make sense? So we then no longer need this one. And let's just start by writing some code here before I can show you actually the compiled CSS to show you that it works the exact same way. So display, I'll put them as inline blocks so that they are nicely sitting side by side, just like this exactly. So the 3 LI elements are D3, right? And so you can already see that this has worked, right? We also put a margin left here of, let's say, 30 pixels. And again, you saw that it worked. So let's take a look at the uncompiled CSS, or actually the compiled CSS, sorry. And so yeah, this is the code that I showed you initially. And it is the result of the nesting that we did in SASS. Great, so this gives us a really cool new tool. We can actually also increase the space here of this panels so that we can see the code a bit better. And so yeah, now you know how nesting works in SASS. But that's not all. Nesting can be even more powerful than this. Let's say you wanted to format only the first element here, only the first li element. So you could very simply use the first child pseudo class, right? I'm sure you're already familiar with that. And so what you can do, for example, would be something like this. So li and then last child, right? And we can then say that we want no margin in there, margin 0. And so it worked. Now actually we want, sorry, not the last child, but the first child. And so it works just as intended, right? However, we can do better than this, because we are repeating the li here, right? So we could actually nest this even deeper. So there's no limit to how far you can nest. So you can put a nested selector inside a nested selector inside a nested, and so on and so forth. So you could go really deep with your nesting. Okay, but getting back to what we were doing, what we can do here in order to avoid the repetition here of this li is to simply nest this inside here and remove this li from here like this, and then finally replace it with the ampersand. So what does this ampersand symbol here actually do? Well, what it does is to actually write the selector path up until this point. So in this case, this here will be replaced with navigation li. So let me actually write it out for you, because I know it can seem a bit complicated. So what we have here in practice is navigation li and then first child. Right? This is what we have. Now in here you didn't need the ampersand symbol, because in the markup the li is actually inside the navigation. So here this li is inside this ul with the navigation class, right? And so you don't need to use the ampersand in here. But here in this case, this first child pseudo class is actually attached to the li, as you can see here. So there's no space here. If you would do it like this without the ampersand, then it would do like this. And you see that it no longer works then here in the code, because this is not what we want. We want it to be like this. And so we have to repeat like this piece of code here, which is exactly the ampersand. So again, this ampersand basically writes out the selector at this current point here. And so in here, what we have at this point is navigation li, and then from here the first child. So let's take a look at the compiled code again. And so this is exactly what I was telling you. So it converts then to this code, which is exactly what I showed you and what we want in order for this to work. So usually when we have a pseudo class like this one, we have to use this ampersand operator, let's call it like that. Okay, so next up we want to style the links here, right? And now they are inside actually of the li element. So where do we put it? That's right, we put it here inside this li selector. And so this is again in the third level already. You shouldn't go deeper than this. So in here we have .navigation and then li and then a. So this is going to translate to this selector here, right? So what we're writing in here will be equivalent to writing this piece of code. So let's just say that we want text decoration none and text transform to uppercase. And you saw that it applied these styles, right? So really cool. We can also set a color here. And since we're talking about colors, let's actually add another variable. So let's say we want color text dark. So I'm going to put a dark gray here, and then in here we say color text dark. And then hopefully our links will turn gray. And yeah, so here they are. Actually, we should use the link pseudo class here. Okay, doesn't make much of a difference, but it's just better. Okay, as a next step, let's get these buttons here. So this button element here, so the div with the class button, floating to the right side here. Okay, So let's just do that. Buttons, I can actually call it buttons. Float. Right? So let's change it here as well. So let's call it buttons. And so now they are here. Now I should also then float this part here to the left. So navigation, where is it? And float left. Now what's going to happen? Yeah, that's right. So the background color here disappeared, and that's because all of the child elements of this container, of this nav container here, are floating, and so the element collapses and it loses all its height. And we can actually see this in the inspector. So actually, where is this? So yeah, here. So here we can see up there, well, you will see it here. So it says that there's a height of 0 pixels. And so again, this happens because all the child elements of this nav element are currently floated. And so what do we have to do here? We can use the clear fix method. And I'm sure you're already familiar with that one as well. I showed it to you in my other course. So every CSS developer which uses floats also uses clear fix in order to fix this problem. And so, do you remember how we used to do that? We usually created a class, called it clearfix, and then added it to that element. So just like adding class clearfix in here. And we can actually do that right now. But I will then show you another way. So class clearfix, and then in here we create this class as well. Or we select the element. And so the clearfix works like this. So the content is empty, and actually this, of course I forgot that what this actually does is to add a pseudo element after the collapsed element. And so basically it's this pseudo element, this clearfix pseudo element, that is then going to clear this float. And it will do so with the clear both property. And also we should set the display to table. And so here we go. So the clearfix class worked, it fixed this collapsed element. Now instead of writing this separate class, we could simply add it here to the nav, right? So this would actually be the exact same thing as writing this, right? Because it's to the nav element that we actually want to attach this pseudo element, which then clears the float. And we can do even better with this, right? Do you already see the solution, what we can do? And that's right, we can put it in here. We can once again nest the selectors. And then here, what do we put here? Exactly, we put the ampersand operator. And that's it. So it's back to working here. And so this here will be replaced with nav. And then from there, we add the pseudo element. So let's just check that just to make sure. And so here we go. So again, we have to use this ampersand because if we wouldn't use it, then this is what it would look like. So nav and then the space, as I was telling you in the beginning, and then the after. But that's not what we want. And so we need to attach the ampersand operator in here. All right, and just to finish this lecture, let's now very quickly style these two buttons here as well. And so that we can use these other color variables that we already defined before. So we have two buttons here. We have the button main and the button hot. So some of their aspects will actually be pretty similar, so let's group them together here. So the main button and the hot button, both with the link pseudo class. Alright, we want them to have a padding of 10 pixels. We want them to be displayed as inline blocks. And now you see that their padding is actually applied here on all the entire element, not just on the left and right. So now the box model works on them as if they were block elements, as I was explaining you in one of the theory lectures. We want their text to be centered. We want a border radius of 100 pixels, so again a really huge number just to give them these rounded corners. Of course we also want to get rid of the underlining. So text decoration none, and also to make them uppercase. We can also set their width. And I think this is a good time to use another variable. So variables don't just have to be colors, of course. We can use everything for variables. So let's create another variable here and call it width for the button. And so let's say we want 150 pixels here for the width. So if we then later wanted to, for example, change this design aspect, then instead of having to go down there to the button, we could just change the settings here, this variable setting. So this variable here could act as a setting, okay? So our variable name is width button. And so yeah, so you saw the effect here, they are now larger than they were before. Okay, so these are the main definitions, and now let's give each of them a different background color. So button main, and we actually want one background color on the normal link state and then a different one for the hover state. So how could we do that using nesting? Do you have any idea? So I will give you a hint. We don't need to write them here in the first selector, so in the beginning of the selector. We can use nesting for both of these states. So how are we going to do that? And we do it like this. We use again the ampersand and then link. And that's it. So it doesn't just work, of course, for the after pseudo class or for the first or last child pseudo classes. It works for all of these as well, like link or hover as well. So hover. And so this will translate into button main link and button main hover. So background color. And here let's use our color secondary. And let's see, and yeah, here it goes. Great. There's a cool trick, a cool thing that I can show you, which is also part of SASS. So background color, which is to use a color function. So SASS comes in with a couple of built-in color functions, which can make your life a bit easier. So instead of having to calculate another color, so for example, we imagine we want this button to become a bit darker as soon as we hover it. Instead of having to calculate or to figure out another color for this, we can simply use one of the built-in color functions, which is called darken. And so we say darken, and then we put our color, and again we can use our variable here, so color secondary. And now it's already paying off to having this color stored in a variable, right? Because then we don't have to write it all over again. And now let's say we wanted to make just 15% darker. And that's what this does. And let's now test it. And yeah, so it's a bit darker. You can put it only 5% darker. Let's see how that looks like. So now you see it's only getting slightly darker. But let's get back to our 15% as we had it. So let's take again a look at the compiled CSS. So we have the link and the hover state as we specified. Then here this is the color that SASS calculated, which is like 15% darker than this one. All right, cool. And now we can just do the same thing here for the other button as well. So this is very similar, so I can just copy the code, so hot. Then here the tertiary. Yep, that's right. Then copy it here. And so it gets also darker as we hover it. Now, just to show you another one, there's also lighten. And as you can imagine, this will do the opposite. So it will turn the color lighter. And yeah, so it works. Maybe that's a bit too much. We can just put like 10%. And yeah, great. And now we want also a color in here, right, for these two buttons. So let's say color. And actually we want like a white color or something like that. So let's just define another variable here, color, text, light. We can make it maybe not completely white, but something similar. So instead of FFF, we can use EEE. Okay? Let's take a look how this looks like. So we call it color, text, light. Let's see. Oh yeah. So it looks good, right? So I think this small example was a great use case of using variables and nesting for the first time. So I hope that you really grasped these concepts and that you fully understood them and that you're now ready to use them in the real world. What I want you to do now is to again take a look at the compiled CSS and carefully compare it with the code that we just wrote. So just so you make really sure that you understood what happens here behind the scenes of SASS, so what exactly it does with these variables and with all this nesting. Okay, so in the next lecture we're going to be back to this example, and then I'm going to introduce you to mixins, functions, and extends. So keep tuned for that one. Welcome back to the second part of the SASS intro lectures. And this time I'm going to show you how to use SASS mixins, extends, and functions in practice. And let's start with mixins. So what is a mixin? It's actually very simple. A mixin is just a reusable piece of code that we write into a mixin, okay? And then whenever we use that mixin, that code is then put in the place where we used or where we called that mixin. So you can imagine this like a huge variable with multiple lines of code, okay? And this is how it works. Imagine that we wanted to use the clear fix not only on the navigation, but on multiple places throughout the page. So imagine this would be a huge web page, and we would have to use the clear fix all over the place. It would not be really practical to add this piece of code here inside all of these elements, right? So instead, we can just make this a mixin and then just include the mixin here in this place. So let me show you how that works. So I'm going to put the mixin in here, and then I have to write add mixin, give it a name, clear fix in this case, and then I just need to put the code here. So let me get this one here, put it there, and all right. And so basically we now have stored this entire piece of code here inside of this mixin, which you can think of a variable called clearfix. So it's a mixin called clearfix. And now how do we actually use this mixin? It's very simple. All we have to do is to now say add include. Add include and then the name of the mixin, of course. Clearfix. And that's it. Now it should be back, and yep, here it is. So we could now go ahead and use this clearfix here wherever we wanted on our page if we had a bigger project. Again, let's take a look at the compiled CSS, and yeah, here it is. So indeed, now here is the clearfix, right? So these are mixins. Now I can actually show you another cool example of mixins, because mixins are actually even more powerful than that. So take a look at this piece of code here. For this link here, we have text decoration, text transform, and a color, right? But down here, when we define these buttons, we have the exact same thing here as well. We have text decoration to none, text transform to uppercase, and then a color. Now the color is actually different, but let's think about that later, okay? So what we can do is to simply put these 3 lines of code into a mixin and then call this mixin in each of these declaration blocks, right? So instead of repeating the code, we have it in one central place. And this is called the dry principle, which means don't repeat yourself. And this again comes back to all this talk that we had about maintainable and reusable code and all this stuff, okay? So let's now do that actually. Put this here. All right. So this piece of code we're going to put in a new mixin. And let's call it style link text. All right, so mixin style link text. We can now go ahead and then use it. We actually just copy the name, because now you see the buttons, they are not styled as they were before, right? So let's go back to where we removed this code. It was here. And so let's say include style link text. And here we go. And we can now do the same in here. So include style link text. Okay, now what happened here? This text just turned white, of course, because here we said that the color should be the light text color, right? So what can we do here? And this is perfect for me to show you something which we can do with mixins, which is basically to pass it an argument. So like this. So what is an argument? An argument is something that we can pass into the mixin, and the mixin will then use this argument here, like as a variable. So what we do here is to define this call variable, which stands for color, actually call it color, And then in here, we put color, okay. And now when we call this mixin, when we include the mixin, we will pass into this mixin the color that we want, which will then be called color, and this color then becomes this color. So this one and this one, they are then the same. But let me show you with an example. So in here, we want to use the variable called text color dark, right? I think it's actually called color text. Well, it's still not working. So let's take a look here at this error sign that we have here. Oh, it's gone. Why is that? So color text dark and color text dark. Yeah, so it should actually work. So let's check again what's going on down here. But it should actually be working. Maybe I cannot call this call here. I mean, maybe I cannot call it color. Just call it call. It's also not changing anything. Now I think I found the error, and it's not working because down here we also used the mixin, but we didn't specify the argument, right? So in here we want color text light. So let's see if it works now. Let's reload this thing. Okay, first save it and then reload. And all right, so finally now we got it to working. And so now let me explain you again what happens here. So in here we include the mixin with a variable which is color text dark. So this is an argument for the mixin, okay? So this will get passed into the mixin and will be called call in here inside internally in this mixin. This thing, this variable, this text, or whatever we pass into here is now called call here inside in this mixin. And so here we call it call, and so what we passed inside of the style link text mixin is then called call, and we can use it in here. And so in the first example it was called color text dark, and so that was passed in here and is then replaced by color text dark, which is this. And down here, where is it? And down here we pass color text light into the style link text mixin, and so this time call will be that. So it will be replaced then by color text light, which is EEE. So you got that? Basically, this allows us to pass some information into this mixin, and then the mixin can use that information. And so these are the two use cases for mixins. So we have the normal one without any arguments, where it is just this code, which is then pasted wherever we included the mixin, and in this case we get to pass an argument as well. And so this is actually a bit similar to functions, which work in the same way. Now I already showed you functions actually before, down here. Let me get some more space. Okay, so we used functions before, which is this one, darken and lighten. So this actually works in the same way. We pass in the arguments, which are color secondary in 15% in this case, and then the function does something with this data, with this information we passed in, and then it puts the data in here. It replaces what we wrote here with the result of the function. So let's see, for example, in the button main for the hover. So button main for hover, the result of that function is this color, EA5717. Okay, so again, a function takes arguments just like a mixin, then it does something with these arguments and returns them. So if you're familiar with programming in general, like JavaScript or something, then it works the exact same way. Now we are not restricted to using the built-in SASS functions. We can also write our own functions. I actually personally don't find them so useful, but of course I'm going to show you how they work. Okay, now imagine we just want a very simple function which simply divides the two arguments that we pass into the function. Now we wouldn't really need a function for this, because in SASS you can just do math operations like that, but let's suppose we would find this function useful. Okay, so we can say add function, and then we can specify our arguments. And just like in the mixins, we can put whatever variable names in here. So these are the arguments, not really variables, but arguments. So A and B, and then what it does, is it will return a divided by b. And that's it. So this is how a function works like. We pass arguments into it, it then does something with these arguments and returns it here with the return keyword. Now if you want to use it, for example here, then we can try that. Well, actually I forgot something here, which is of course the name of the function. Okay, so sorry. Let's call it divide. So the function of course needs to have a name, and then we specify the arguments for that function. Now if we wanted to use it somewhere, let's try that out. So we can just say divide, remember it was 30, so let's just say 60 and then 2. So let's see what that does. And actually it doesn't do anything, and I'm going to show you why here in the inspect. And that's because this gives, of course, 30, but the 30 doesn't have any unit. And so CSS doesn't know what we mean here. So 30 what? 30% or pixels or centimeters or whatever. So it doesn't really know what the 30 is. So if you want to fix that, there's an easy fix. And the best practice to do it in SASS is by multiplying it by 1 pixel. So if we want pixel, then we multiply this result by 1 pixel, and then it's back to working, okay? Now, of course, this isn't really practical, because all we really want here is 30 pixels. But this is just to show you how we could theoretically use functions to do this kind of calculations. And we could, of course, do much more complex stuff, much more complex calculations, instead of just dividing one number by the other. All right, so we talked about mixins, about functions, and now let's take a look at extents. So let's go down here, because we're going to use the extend feature here on the buttons. So what do extents do? Basically, we can write a placeholder and put a bunch of styles in there, and then have other selectors extend that placeholder. So if that sounds a bit confusing, let me show it to you in practice, okay? So the things that are common to these buttons, I will just put them in a placeholder. And we write a placeholder in SASS like this, so the percentage sign, and then I just call it button placeholder. Okay? And now I'm going to put all of these styles in there. Okay? And I'm doing that because all of this duplicate code here doesn't look really good, right? It's really not following the don't repeat yourself principle here, right? So you see button main link here, and button main link here again, and button hot link here, and again button hot link in here. So we're using these selectors like twice. And so what we can do instead is to put all of this here into this placeholder. And now we're simply going to extend these selectors here that we already have. So all I have to do is to write extend and then button placeholder. And the same thing down here. So I will now extend this one here as well. And these buttons are back to working right now. So great. So again, we just extended these two selectors here, so this one and this one, with the code that we have here in this placeholder. Now you may ask, well, why didn't we just make a mixin with this code and then simply include this mixin in these two selectors, right? Now let me show you that the result is actually different. Okay, first let me save it, and I will see the compiled CSS now. And so this is what happened actually. It actually created this block of code, which in practice looks the same way it did before. So we have this button main link and this button hot link together again, just as we had before. But that's no problem, we're still following the don't repeat yourself principle, because what matters is the source code that we write, and not the compiled final CSS code. It's not a problem if the same code appears multiple times in the compiled final file, but in the source code, that's the one that we should keep dry. So with don't repeat yourself in mind. So what happened here in fact was that it's really different than a mixin. So this code was in fact not copied to here, right? But what happened was that this selector here was basically copied here, right? So if this was a mixin, then all this code would have been copied here into this selector, right? Into this one and here into this one. So with a mixin, that code would now be here. But with an extend, it's the other way around. What happens is that the selector is copied here to here to this rule. And so now we have button main link and button hot link in here in this selector, right? So this is what we have. So although they look like they're doing the same, they're in fact fundamentally different in the way they work behind the scenes. Now you should only ever use extends if the rules that we're extending are inherently and thematically related. And that's the case with these buttons, right? So they are really related. And so that's not going to cause a maintenance problem further down the road. Now, personally, I'm not such a big fan of these extends. Whenever I can, I prefer to just use a Mixins to do this kind of stuff. But in this particular example, actually the extend would be the correct tool to do this. Because again, these two buttons where we use the extends, they are actually related. Now, if you wanted to extend like this link here, and then maybe the nav element, and then also the navigation li elements, now then we would mix all these unrelated selectors, these unrelated elements all together, and that wouldn't be a good practice. So again, just use extends when the selectors or the elements that you're extending are actually pretty related to one another. Okay, once again, I want you to review all the code that we wrote, as well as the final compiled CSS code, so that you understand what's going on here. What you will notice is that, for example, the function and the mixin, they will, just like the variables, they will not produce any final CSS code, of course, because their only purpose is to help us writing our code. So after reviewing this, you will then understand how variables, nesting, mixins, extends, and functions work in SASS. At least it should give you a pretty good overview. Of course, from now on in the project, we are going to use only SASS, which is going to make our life a lot easier, especially in conjunction with the block element modifier methodology. But I'm going to talk about that later when we continue with the project. So take a look at the code right now and see you next time.